Hi, I am Mary Sue Koeppel, the editor of Kalliope. Welcome to Writer to Writer. With me today is Connie May Fowler, novelist. Welcome.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Tell us about yourself, Connie.
Well, I'm born and bred Floridian. I was actually born in North Carolina, but I tell people I was conceived in Florida, so that makes me a Floridian. And within days of my birth, I was brought back to the state. My parents are vagabonds, basically, and I had I lived a very marginal childhood. My father was a kind of very southern, wild Baptist, and my mother was a former nun. And so that made for a very fiery marriage. And also within the family, there was a lot of domestic violence. And and I'm the youngest of 3 children. Mm-hmm. And then my father died when I was, I believe, 7. And after that, even though my mom had suffered so much abuse at the hands of my father, I don't think she could ever cope with losing him. Mm-hmm. And we were very, very poor. We lived on welfare. Mm-hmm. And she grew more and more bitter. And she began drinking more and more. And as that progressed, she became abusive to her children. So my sister and my brother was gone by then, so my sister and I ended up being abused until we left home and until she died at the young age of 58. Mm.
And your work as a writer?
My work as a writer, writing for me was a way to survive those really horrible circumstances. I'll never forget our little bedroom at Jacksonville Beach, and that my sister and I shared, and my parents would be fighting in the next room, and it was a nightly occurrence, every single night, just a horrible, horrible fighting. And to block out the fighting, I would beg for my sister to read to me, and she would, and it was so kind of in an odd way, a wonderful memory to have your big sister be the first storyteller in your life. And she would read to me, and sometimes I would even have the books memorized, like Dr. Seuss and stuff like that. And but I just needed the sound of her voice, which I think is real interesting. Before I could read, I could still follow the words and know what they meant, but I still needed that voice. But then as soon as I could read, I started, and reading and writing went hand in hand. I could tell that page anything, and it didn't judge me. So I really think in that sense, writing in the world of books really saved my life.
Mm-hmm. And when did you start writing, Connie?
I was writing as soon as I could put words together, and it would be, everything from poems to stories to songs. It didn't matter. I was like a scribbler savant. Mm-hmm. To make matters even more complicated, I had a really, really terrible speech impediment. And subsequently, I've learned that it was probably caused by my home circumstances. I was so scared that whatever I might say would cause me to get beaten that I was always a nervous wreck, and it would just come out in this kind of blah, 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 blah. And so what happened is I just finally became silent. And while that sounds kind of terrible, it was actually kind of wonderful, because what it meant was it made me listen. And we had an amazing assortment of people around us, and so I was like the proverbial fly on the wall. And I just sat there and soaked it all in, and I think at that point I really kind of fell in love with language and the sound of the human voice. And I think that is really instrumental in part of my beginnings as a writer. And I think it might also have to do with why I so very often write in first person, because I just hear these voices.
Connie, Remembering Blue, one of your latest books, is a novel set in very much a sense of place. And I felt as if when I was reading that book, that what you were concentrating on is the 2 characters, but more important even than the 2 characters was a sense of place. Am I
No, I think that's
correctly?
Exactly right. And the main character, Maddie, she was born in Jacksonville Beach, and her father abandoned the family when she was 7. She had not a physically abusive mother, but a very withholding mother. Mm-hmm. So she really grew up kind of unloved and feeling like an orphan. And with no sense of place and no sense of direction, no sense of being grounded in any way, and also no sense of family. And then when she meets Nick Blue, who lives on this absolutely idyllic island off the Florida Gulf Coast, and they are so entrenched in nature, and they make their living from the sea. They die at sea. They are birthed at sea. And so it's such an important component in her healing and in her actualization to suddenly understand where it is she lives.
Mm-hmm. So you very much concentrated on sense of place.
Oh, absolutely.
Even her garden.
Even her garden. Poor Maddie, her mother-in-law insists that she become a gardener, and she has to go through quite a bit to accomplish that. But that's something that's reflected in my own life. I think that you've got to understand, where it is you live. And also the thing with Maddie and gardening was an awful lot about life cycle, and which unfortunately she comes to face in ways that we, hopefully the reader hopes that it won't happen, but it does. But all of that, the gardening, the cooking, all of that is about sense of place, finding out the little tiny treasures from day to day that make up a life.
Do you think there's more sense of place in this novel than in your other ones?
Well, I think they all have a strong sense of place. In fact, it really sort of drives the novels. And when I wrote Sugar Cage, which was my first novel, I was in graduate school at University of Kansas, and it was really my first time out of Florida for a real prolonged period of time. And I just could never really, I was a Florida girl. I couldn't understand Kansas, and I could never feel at home there. But the book started out as a short story that was set in Kansas. And when my professor said, you really need to try to turn this into a novel, I was like, I had no idea how to do this. As I was driving around that really kind of cold, barren landscape, trying to figure out how I was going to accomplish what my professor had ordered, it dawned on me that I had to change the setting to Florida. I had to write about a place that I really understood, that I loved, that I felt was sort of bred in my bones. And once I changed the setting, everything seemed to crystallize, and the novel sort of flew from that point. And a lot of my characters, when they feel divorced from where they're at, or when they have no understanding from that, there are parts of their personality that just aren't well formed yet. They have to have that sense of place in order to lead healthy lives.
Do you find this true of other novelists, or is this something you find very special to yourself?
No, I think sense of place is terribly important to all novelists, whether they're writing about Brooklyn or Cleveland or the West Coast. Sense of place is one of the most paramount things that a writer needs to develop.
I got this sense when I was reading Remembering Blue, almost of the Buddhist consciousness of, I am where I am this moment.
That's really an interesting thing, and I think that Nick especially espouses that. And he also, he has quite the learning curve, because he decides that the place that he loves is a place of danger for him, and he goes on a journey, and he leaves that place, but of course he has to return, but he learns to accept that he can't change fate, and to in some ways even welcome it, whatever that may be.
Your dolphins and this wonderful birth experience of Nick's mother. I find that my favorite part of the whole novel, Remembering Blue. You're very good at describing this almost idyllic birth.
Well, it's kind of odd since I've never given birth.
Well, I was wondering if you were going to comment on that. Yeah.
But also,
Nor have I.
Okay, well, good. But there's something, I think in each of my novels thus far there is a birth scene, and I'm fascinated with it. And I really do like the birth scene in Remembering Blue, because she's on the ship, and the ship's going down, and the poor husband has no idea, and it's sort of a metaphor for life. And I love it when she just decides that, she with the practiced efficiency of a woman who knows that nature almost always takes its course. She just does it, you know, however dirty or nasty it gets, she just takes care of things. I mean, it's not an easy birth, and it's a really frightening birth because she's doing it alone and the ship's going down, but it really does stand as a metaphor for their lives.
In which book was it where the baby comes floating in the tiny coffin?
That was in Remembering Blue. And in the, not Remembering Blue, that was in River of Hidden Dreams.
Yes.
And in that book, there's a birth scene where Mr. Sammy actually is at the birth and delivers the child. And as he's walking out the door, his mother tells him, remember cold water shocks. And he has no idea what that means, but then the baby's born not breathing. And he remembers, okay, cold water shocks.
Now, obviously, you're making that up. I mean, these are things that you're drawing from your imagination, never having had a birth, as you just said. But you have all these beautiful things in terms of sense of place. So obviously, it's the imagination which is at work here, plus a lot of grounding in reality. Talk to us about how the novelist works.
Well, the novelist, first and foremost, has to be incredibly tenacious. It's a lonely life, and it's an obsessive life. And the sitting down in the chair every day and doing the work isn't necessarily always fun, and sometimes it's really grueling and frustrating. In the end, it's incredibly rewarding, and I think that all novelists will tell you that it's something that they have to do. But it's an odd life, too, because the characters become so much a part of who you are. I mean, they really are alive. And I find myself, when I'm working on certain sections with a single character, it's almost like being a method actor. I begin taking on their characteristics. And so when I walk out of the office, I'm sort of still in character, you know, so it's Maddie cooking dinner, not Connie. So I have to remind myself, no, okay, you're through working for the day. But really, in a sense, you're not. I think novelists work 24 hours a day. I mean, so much of any kind of creative writing, so much of the work goes on when you're not even thinking about it. It comes from some kind of primordial subconscious area of the brain, and it's always so surprising when it comes out on the page, and even, you know, novelists go, where did that come from? Mm-hmm. And it's an act of discovery every day you sit down.
Mm-hmm. Well, like your lists of butterflies or your lists of birds. Do you go to a book to find all that out, or is this part of your life now?
Both. I do, just like Maddie does. I have all the little reference books about shells and birds and butterflies, and she was sort of a wonderful character to plop into this idyllic island, because she didn't know anything about it, and so I could really show it and write about it with almost childlike eyes. And she reveals it a little bit at a time, the more and more that she learns about it.
Sure, that she discovers it. Let's talk a little bit about your being an author and going on tour. One of your books was picked up by Oprah. For those of us who perhaps would like the inside look at how all this functions, and this is a writer-to-writer program, can you tell us some of the little inside? How did you get to be, for example, on Oprah's list?
She loved the cover.
Well, how did she get it?
My agent sent it to her.
Okay.
But you know, agents send every book to Oprah, and she saw the cover, which I'm so proud. My husband took the photograph that's on the cover for that book, and it's really a lovely cover. And so that caused her to pick it up, and she read the first paragraph, and she said she loved it, and she called my agent right away, and she said, you know, I'm reading such and such a book now, but my next book I'm going to read is this one. And Joy called, my agent called and told me, and I'm like, yeah, you know, I just didn't believe it, really. It's like, that's nice, but, and darned if about a week later the phone didn't ring, and it was Oprah calling me directly.
Now, was this it was turned into a movie, and she played the part of Zora.
Right, she played Miss Zora.
And who wrote the screen script? I heard
wrote
it was
the
you.
screenplay.
You did.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about that.
That was a really difficult experience. And in fact, I didn't want to do it. And I kept saying that, I kept declining.
Why?
Because I felt, at first I thought they were asking to be polite. And I was going to be the kind of writer that Hollywood really likes, which is one that didn't want to be involved. And so, but then they kept being persistent, and I'm like, well, they certainly don't know how to just take no for an answer when someone's trying to be polite. And then later on, the producer said, don't you know people in Hollywood don't do anything to be polite? She said, no, we really wanted you. And the more I talked to them, the more I came to trust them and to feel that they really wanted to stay true to the book. And they convinced me that I was the person who would bring that to it, that much of the idiosyncratic language and to me, the place isn't idiosyncratic because I lived that novel. I grew up in that little travel trailer, but I guess that's not an average experience. So eventually I was convinced that I should try it, but I told them, yes, that I would do it as long as they gave me all the help I requested and that they would not hold that against me. And so they agreed to that.
What kind of help did you get?
Well, I needed to read scripts. I had never written a script before, and TV is a very special format. And so, but even though it was for television, they sent me movie scripts and a wide variety of movie scripts. And it was simply scripts they thought were really well written that succeeded in what they set out to do.
And what did you learn from that?
Well, for one, it was everything from Chinatown to Big. There was no rhyme or reason really, except that they all were successful in the writing. And I just sort of tried to immerse myself in that form and to study how, a book is so internal. You can display your character's thoughts, dreams, hopes, fears, and go on and on for pages in an internal fashion. But in a script, it's all got to be somehow conveyed pretty much through words and through trusting the director of photography and the director. So I learned to, I felt like it was turning my brain inside out. So instead of thinking internally, I was thinking externally.
You had to show it. Connie, when the film was over, were you satisfied?
Oh, I think that they did a fabulous job. I think that it would have been great if it had been the big screen instead of the small screen, but on the other hand, as Oprah told me, a whole lot more people saw it because it was for TV. And that's what she feels is part of her mission, I think. I thought that the performances were absolutely amazing. Every single person was so good. And the whole experience was, one, I was so tied to it that it would be hard to be critical of it. But also, the first day I walked onto the set, and I wasn't expecting this to happen at all, but the first day I walked onto the set, I just fell apart. And I had dealt with this material for so long as a writer, in both short stories and poems and novels, and then I wrote the script, so you'd think I'd be like, no big deal. But it was as if I had just walked into a 3D recreation of my childhood. And they were great. They stopped filming. They took me on a little tour. They didn't seem to mind that I couldn't stop crying. And eventually, I was trying to figure out what it was that upset me so much, and I realized that I felt guilty, that as if I didn't deserve what was happening. Being a novelist is such a private act that's really different than a film where so many people's creativity comes into play, and they had all worked so hard. And so it was really a real example of art being therapy.
That sounds wonderful. Could we just change it just a little bit from art as therapy to art as travel?
Hey.
And I know that you're going on many book tours these days. Tell us what a book tour is like. Who sets it up? How do you get involved? I saw one of your schedules that just flabbergasted me. You were in St. Louis one day, in California the next, and How do you maintain yourself? Who sets it up, first of all?
Okay, the publisher sets it up, and publishers have little publicity departments and people called publicists, and they do all of that. In fact, Doubleday has their own, which is part of Random House. They have their own, the Random House tour agency, travel agency, and so they don't even job that out. It's all in-house. And then, you know, you just get this huge itinerary that they've planned, and they try to put in as much that they just, you'll be up, you know, sometimes you maybe get 2 or 3 hours sleep, if you're lucky. One time I hadn't slept in 2 days and hadn't eaten in probably 3, anything other than like potato chips.
Why do they do that to you?
I don't think they understand because they've never been on a tour. And to them, they just want you to get as much publicity as you can. They want you to do as many TV shows as they can, and many radio shows, and get into as many bookstores. And they're myopic. That's what they want, and there's not a whole lot of care taken about the writer's physical and spiritual condition.
Do they pick you up? Does somebody go along with you? What are the mechanics?
Yeah, there's this really odd little cottage industry called media escorts, and they flourish in larger towns. They get a lot of writers, and they pick you up at the airport, and they take you to all your appointments, and they're supposed to do anything for you that you need. You know, you need a foot rub, they'll get you somebody to get you a foot rub. They take you to dinner. And that's their whole job, is just to cart writers around when they're in town.
But you went 3 days without food.
That's because of the scheduling was so horrible. And there just wasn't time. And what would happen is that I would have a signing at a bookstore, and I would get back into the hotel after the restaurant had closed, so I couldn't get room service. And then I would be out before the restaurant opened, so I couldn't get breakfast either. And then I remember I bumped myself up to first class because I thought, oh, I'll get to eat. And I was in the last seat, and by the time they got to me, they had run out of food. It was like, you can't do this to me. And they gave me a voucher for a drink. It's not a drink I need. I need food.
Oh, Connie, this sounds awful. I'm just asking you these questions because there are a lot of writers who are going to be watching this program, and we perhaps think about the tour as this grand, glorious experience.
No, it sounds glamorous on the face of it, but it's really not. And I mean, I guess I know some writers who don't mind it, but most writers I know really have a tough time with it because we're solitary people. You know, most of us are real homebodies, and we never knew that touring like this was part of the job description. We thought the job description was to keep our tails in the chair and write. And then to suddenly ask us to be kind of public people, it can be really very difficult.
We only have a few minutes left. Connie, what would be your advice to writers?
Well,
besides sit in the chair and do it.
Yeah, that's my main advice. And to rewrite. I never stop rewriting. It has to like be physically removed from me before I stop rewriting. And when writers say that the first thing they write in their first draft is what, I don't believe them. I just don't believe them. It sounds kind of fabulous, but it's a very, very complicated process, and nobody gets it right the first try.
You're a poet. Now tell us how a poet writes a novel in 30 seconds.
It's the same form to me. It's simply a longer form, and you pay attention to every word and every sound and every metaphor. It's the exact same process.
When you write the novel, you have the characters. When you write the poem, you mostly have sense of place or lyricism. But when you put it together in your novels, we have both.
Oh, that's very nice.
And that's what I find so beautiful about your writing, Connie. The poet is speaking usually. I want you to know that the books that you have written are very special to the whole power of Florida and the sense of place of Florida. And I'm delighted that you joined us today. This has been Writer to Writer, and I'm Mary Sue Koeppel. And thank you for joining us.